G'day all, welcome back to another episode of Off the Rock, your weekly rugby breakdown with me, John Ferguson. And today I am joined by a very special guest, someone who me as a budding analyst really has a lot of time for, in the sense that I'm amazed at the amount of numbers that he gets through, taken personally from me, because I am terrible with the numbers from a raw aspect. It's a very big welcome to Gainland Analytics co-founder, Ben Darwin. Ben, thank you very much for coming on. Welcome. How you doing?
Pleasure, John. I'm good. My 4 kids are driving me insane, so I'm happy to be in the office on an afternoon when my wife is dealing with them, not me.
Well, I won't keep you for too long, but if that's
No, please.
that's
Let's go 3 or 4 hours. Let's go 3 or 4 hours.
So I just wanted to run through your resume. You're a very proud former Wallaby and former ACT Brumby, and you've worked in a number of coaching roles around the world, as well as performance analysis, and that's taken you across the globe. And I just think now you've got this company of this co-founder of Gainlands Analytics. Can you just quickly, before we get into the meats and bones, we're going to talk all things British and Irish Lions, Wallaby, Super Rugby, cohesion, going through some numbers which are far too grand for me. But just for the truest, the purists, how does one get into what you're doing? Because some people don't see the dark arts of mathematics and analytics coming from the front row, but you guys are obviously and most often the brightest on the field. So how does that come about?
I think it's a mix of number of things. One is I was coming off the back of playing. I sort of jumped very quickly into coaching, but I'd always been at least trying to be quite thoughtful about the world around me and trying to make sense of it. And I had ADHD, which I didn't have diagnosed till like 2008, but I always thought very much in terms of holistically and in systems, and I never really kind of understood why until I got my sort of diagnosis. But I was always really interested, for example, like, why does Australian rugby punch above its weight, if that's a turn of phrase? Like, why are we doing better? Because I'd always find ways in many things to sort of almost doubt myself. Like, okay, I can't be that good. There must be some advantage here I'm gaining through something. So, and things like, when I was at the Brumbies, people say, oh, you must have a wonderful culture. I'm like, do you know, some of the guys in our team? Like, that doesn't make sense to me. Not in terms of not being bad, but just like we're all just normal guys, right? But yet there seemed to be some sort of advantage we're gaining, and I suppose I've learned to understand that now. But when I was coaching in Japan in 2008, the financial crisis hit, and I was worried that NTT, because we had multiple teams, we had and they've actually done this now, they had Docomo, which was the sort of mobile phone arm, and they had the NTT Shining Arcs. And I was worried they're going to shut both of them down. So I thought, if they do that, if I'm doing analytics, that may help, because I was a forwards coach.
Mm.
They ended up doing that, but much later on down the track. And then I came back to Melbourne to spend some time with my wife's family, and bumped into Josh Philpott, who's a coach and now based in the UK. And he was actually in a Rebels training session for a local rugby club. He said, what are you doing here? And I said, oh, just back from Japan. He said, come to Eltham tonight. Melbourne's playing, we're doing a rep team for Victoria. Come and help us look at the props. So I went and looked at the props and spoke to Damien Hill. He said, what are you doing? He said, oh, I'm an analyst. He goes, okay, we don't have one for the Rebels. You're it now. I'm like, okay. I was literally like 3 months into being an analyst. But the good part was with the Rebels was because there was so much chaos, just because of the situation, the fact that I couldn't do analytics was not a problem, because no one else could do anything they were doing anyway, right?
You just swept up in the storm.
Just a couple of weeks ahead, right? And the fact that I'd been part of the other expansion franchise, being in the Force, was some form of an advantage. And so they said, okay, well, like in the first couple of weeks, okay, you do IT as well, right? So you just jump in and do that. So I was supposed to do forwards coaching, but they hired Mark Bakewell, and they had Matty Cobain, who's a great man there as well. So they said, okay, just do the analytics. And then I hired Damon Edmonds, who was from Warringah like yourself, and then ended up was the Wallaby analyst, and he basically did all the work for me, and I just sat and ate snacks and watched YouTube basically for the whole time. But he was like working the detail, and I was trying to work the wider things. So one of the things actually that came up after the second year of the Rebels because there was really high expectations year one of the Rebels. Like, we're going to win 6 games at least. I think the idea was to come second in our pool. Because there was Australian, New Zealand, South Africa pools back then, conferences. And that was now I understand what I do. That's probably a little bit ill-advised to expect such great performance straight off the bat. And so one of the questions I got asked of me as the analyst, like, how long is it going to take for us to win? And it's like, that question led me to this. But when the Rebels started to have some more financial problems, they said, okay, well, you can either stay or we're going to cut your salary in half. I'm like, okay, I might go. So I went off to Suntory, worked there for a year. The team went undefeated, and then they fired me at the end of the season. And I'm like, okay, well, coaching may not be for me. So, but I saw some things that really helped me in terms of this research there.
Like, cool.
Why is this team winning so well? What's the driver of it? And then I came back and then started with this idea of a player database. There's this kind of model in English football where you could go to a website and look at who's off contract and the contractual situation of everyone and when they're coming off. So I thought I'd do that for rugby, and it was just too small a marketplace. But there was some signals I was seeing and how I was constructing the data of the contractual situation of all the players. So I was looking at them historically, and I was like, okay, I can see some patterns here. And then some clubs said, can you talk to us about those patterns? And then here we are. So that
is a whirlwind of a story. That's actually crazy. That you went from Australia to Japan, then back to Melbourne, having been part of the force, and then you were like, you know what, this is just not going to work the way that I thought it was going to work, and then you end up in analytics. That's also just ending up in analytics being like, you're it. That's such a, like, I think most people would love to fall into a job like that. It's not what you planned, but then here you are, a decade later almost, and you're just like, hey, you've got Gainland Analytics as a company. That's awesome.
Well, it's funny because that option 2013, I didn't start. It was basically, I don't know what to do. I've just come back from Japan. So it was, if you watch on LinkedIn for long enough, anybody who has a really good job or a leadership job or anything like that, when they become unemployed, they tend to start consultancy businesses. But that's just like what they do in the interim. Then they go get another job, and the consultancy firm just goes quiet for a while until they become unemployed again. So basically, a consultancy firm is like an unemployment option. It's a glorified unemployment option, and Gainline's basically a glorified unemployment option that's gotten out of hand. Right? It's just kept going. And I got asked in an interview the other day, like, why did you get into this industry, or what was the inspiration behind it? And I said, money, like desperation, like. I had 2 kids. I had no choice but to try to do something. And as my wife says to me, like, sometimes I don't understand how you've created this out of thin air. But it's still going out of thin air, so I'm happy to take that.
Mate, that's awesome to hear, but it's also a crazy story, which I'm so thankful that you've actually done, because now we have lots of rugby to talk about and around it, which also shapes a lot of what rugby teams do around the world. So we're going to get into that in just a second. Now we're going to get into what it says about the rugby, which is why we're here, and it's what we both love and enjoy, and sometimes perhaps spend a little bit too much time on. And so I think we're going to go straight to not the elephant in the room. It's the event of the year, the British and Irish Lions. They're coming down to play Australia. First time, obviously, every 12 years since 2013, where they won the series. Perhaps by the slip of the boot from Curtly Beale, but we're going to get into the details of what actually won that series. But I think I just want to start with, how does one bring together a British and Irish Lions squad? Because you speak a lot about it, you have spoken a lot about, and Gainland Analytics looks at cohesion. But on our prior conversation on the phone leading into this, there's obviously a lot more that goes into cohesion than purely minutes played together, as you explored with me. So how does one actually build a British and Irish Lions squad? And then maybe we'll get into later specifically how this British and Irish Lions squad makes up.
I think what was really interesting was Simon and myself in 2013, when the company had just started, we were in the coach's box for the last 2 Lions tests. So we sort of met Robbie through a guy called Andrew Sullivan, who was the Wallabies analyst at the time. And that was a really interesting process. So having this tour on now is bringing back a lot of memories of those 2 games. and how sad it was for the third test,
Mm.
when things started to go so pear-shaped. So I think it's unlike a lot of other scenarios in that the Lions are fundamentally built to fail. It's not built to work. It's very hard to make it work, and it's why they've had such a hard time of it. But it's getting harder because the clubs are becoming more powerful. And so if you look at some of the early Lions tours, they were like 30 games, very, getting that length of time. And so getting the right amount of time to come together a team is the hard part. So you've got to try to do it in other ways. And I think that coaching the Lions is not like, here you have a test team, put that together and you can get the time to create success or not. Because of the shortness, because of the pressure from the clubs, the amount of time the Lions have seems to be getting shorter and shorter. And so because it's so different to anything else, it's not like Test rugby, it's not like running a club. It's quite similar to a scenario we had a couple of years ago, which we worked with a club to try to save them from relegation. So they had 10 games. It's almost like a tournament. And with this 10 games, I mean, in terms of length, with this 10 games, we focus for them on, don't worry about the first 7, just focus on building a team that we can win 2 of the last 3, which we did. And we saved them, right, from we saved, they saved themselves from relegation with mild assistance from us, but just focusing on how do we put together a good team to be successful. Because with the Lions, the first 6 games don't matter, right, in terms of outcomes. If they lose all of those, they win the tests. That's all that matters.
Yep.
Right. Because sometimes it's just about the strength of opposition as well. So it's so hard for coaches, I think, because doing the Lions is so different to anything else they've ever done before. And what's different with this tour too is you've got a coach who's had mainly a very high cohesion team in Ireland most of the time. And so I think he's going to have some surprises on this trip about what it's actually like to run this team. And added to that, obviously, every single game is away and everyone sees themselves as the underdog, whereas the Lions are the underdog, right? That's, you could say, yes, they're the best players in the world, but the way in which they are constructed is built to be unsuccessful. And I think that more than anything else, you have to look at this tour as one continuum of building as you go through it, and how you build it is actually, so those first 6 games, whilst the results don't count, what you're building is what counts. And the more we've looked at the last 25 years of how they've done it, that's why I think 21 was so hard, because they didn't know what game was going to happen, what was going to be off, what was going to be on. And so the game's been cancelled. There's no way you could build that to be, very successful. But there was an advantage there because with COVID is that the South Africans hadn't really played much either, right? They didn't play at all during 20 from memory. So yeah, it's a very different mechanism, and a team that when it takes the field has pretty much more experience than any test team that's ever played. Right?
Yep.
Like Lions teams are functioning on about double the amount of experience and caps when it takes the field, but it's functioning on Sunwolves cohesion amounts, right?
It is
Early days of Sunwolves type amounts. So that's what they've got to try to build. And we call it like hacking. You can hack your way using other means.
First of all, the term being built, to be unsuccessful, really interesting term because it's what everyone tries to avoid. But I totally understand what you mean with there. But also the fact that the Lions, as you mentioned, come down to their opposition with roughly double the caps of a test side. I'd hate to know what that looks like compared to a Wallaby side that without James Slipper, it's probably 4 times their test experience. But again, that the word cohesion, which I assimilate so much with gainline analytics, why is it that because some of these guys have played, a lot with Leinster, like a lot of the Irish people, and you've got players from the Scottish side that have played together, but also some play a club together. So why doesn't that work in a more detailed kind of from a more detailed factor?
Because unless you're willing to go all the way and say, right, we're going to pick the entire Leinster team, which you can't do because you're not accessing the most talent. It would be unfair and it would be a struggle. Then you're going to have to choose some other people, and that's going to create some gaps, right? And new gaps, new relationships, new experience is where the problem lies. So a team, the easiest way to describe it is a team is only as strong as its weakest link. Okay. So if a team has, for example, 10 guys that have played together their whole lives and 5 completely new players, it'll probably be completely dysfunctional, because the way it works mathematically is that you don't need 10 out of 15 to be functional. You need no dysfunction in those other 5, which is actually more than, and the way that relationships work is that basically that's actually most of the relationships. Does that make sense? So
Yeah.
it's like when you add 2 new teams to a comp. If you add 2 new teams to a competition, then about 40% of the games become crap. Right? The network effect is much greater than you imagine it to be. And
That's
so
really interesting, particularly for those
so
watching from a Super Rugby Pacific example who have had that very thing with Moana and Fiji added. Um, it's just a very it's an example close to home for the Australian audience, but I'm sure that there'd be URC comparatives and whatnot in the Northern Hemisphere. But that flow on effect, I would never have imagined to be that wide on the network.
yeah, and you know, mathematics is pretty simple, right? It's just you just count the relationships and you can see it. But it's interesting too. So I was thinking about this the other day. Is there's a turn of phrase people use, which is you can't shrink yourself to success. But the leagues that go well, interestingly, if you think about when people expand a league, they're trying to make it better, but often make it worse. The teams in Australia that have had the most improvement, which is probably Super Rugby and the NBL, have both shrunk and stabilized. Shrinking and stabilizing a league is probably the best thing you can do for it. When you expand it, and probably the worst expansion I've ever seen was when the netball, we added 3 teams to 5. That would be like adding 8 teams to the AFL in 1 year, right? Because it's basically what it takes from all of the established teams to create new teams, and so it just ruins everyone. So how you expand it, this is a whole different conversation now, isn't it? But you know, how you expand a league is really important.
I knew we'd end up down a rabbit hole, and I'm sure it's not
Yeah,
the
there we go.
last.
Sorry.
But then going on to how that, I guess the next flow-on question is, before we go into the actual this Lion squad, is now that Australian teams have been consolidated in Super Rugby Pacific, how do you think that they are gonna? How do you think they've stacked up this year? But then how do you also think that they're going to stack up against the Lions? Because I think there's a quality gap, obviously, from a test perspective, athlete to athlete. But some of these players have been playing together for a couple of years, and they have that understanding of each other. And I'd say, from a weak link perspective, look at the Brumbies and the Reds, and they have quite few from a terms of cohesion perspective. But then other teams, perhaps like the Waratahs and the Force, are less so fortunate in that aspect.
So what's interesting, if you look at when the URC were changed, what was the Celtic League, and the Welsh went from 11 to 9 to 5 to 4 clubs.
Yep.
Is that the club was affected the least was Scarlets, because it basically just had Clonethley underneath it, and I think they came. So in the first year of that reduction in the number of the Welsh teams, is the team that did the best is the team that took the least players on, right? That's the Brumbies this year. Right?
Yeah.
The Brumbies didn't take any on. And so the teams that have to absorb the pain of that shrinking, which is the Tars, do the worst, right? And so basically what the Tars became this year was a merger.
Composite.
Right? Yeah. And this, it was similar to the Northern Eagles in Rugby League. It was similar to the Force. And what they'll tend to do is they'll tend to be about 3/4 of the way down the table. So when I said the Force, I meant the Rebels Force merger, right? Because most of them came across the Dave Vessels. Is that you come about 3/4 of the way down the table, and you'll do better in attack than you do in defense, basically. And so that's kind of exactly what's happened. And I looked at this across a number of different sort of competitions, and it sort of plays out roughly in the same way. The hard part is that the next kids coming through the Tars have not played with any of those Rebels players. So this
we talked about this on the
it
last
won't
show.
happen. It won't just happen now. It'll happen more, and it'll take time to flush through the system. And so, the numbers for the Tars this year are not good. And it sort of feels like they're starting again.
Yep.
So off we go again. But the Tars system fundamentally is not built to be successful in and of itself.
Can you expand on that? I think there's many people who'd like to know why, seeing as it's the biggest rugby safe haven in Australia from a numbers perspective, and it's got all the prestigious private schools, and I mean you've got Brisbane up as well. But so why is that?
Well, that's the problem, the size, right? Like England sport is huge, but England sport underperforms, right? So the first thing is the size, and so when you have a lot of talent and your talent's not performing as you hope it will, you've got someone else to choose. So you keep on choosing, right? When you have limitations placed upon you, you have a lack of choice. And so sometimes you have to stick with the people you don't think are any good, and then they become good over time. So that's the first component of it. The second part is the structure. So if you look at, we don't really have a tier 3 in Australia. So under Super Rugby. And so they're just not playing together in any form underneath there. And so they're playing 18 games a year. Whereas you look at, say, the Sharks in Super Rugby, URC, or the Bulls, they're generally playing, if you take Curry Cup, you take URC, you take whatever European format they're in, they still had Vodacom Cup, or there's some level under there where it kind of jumps around a little bit. But they're playing, if you take their under 20s as well, let's say the Bulls, they're probably playing 50 to 60 games a year, maybe 70 games a year as their entire system.
Yeah.
Waratahs might be playing 22, 23 at best.
Yeah.
Right. So, and if you don't have anything vertically under that, then it makes it extremely difficult. So it's always, you're just starting again every year. And one of the things that affects performance is, have you played in your first game? Have you played with anyone you played with before? And generally the answer to that is no. So the bigger the system you have under you in terms of its construction will make it harder. If you look at, say, the Broncos, when the Broncos went to multiple feeder clubs in 2006, they haven't won a title since.
Yep.
All the Queensland rugby league teams have multiple feeders, and it just wanes off them a little bit. It's not, say, like Melbourne Storm have 2 feeders, Crusaders had 2 feeders, but it just makes it harder. You have to be more concentrated in other areas. If you look at the early days of the Brumbies and the Crusaders, that was the gift that Crusaders were given, was Canterbury, right? And it's now changed because they've got Tasman Canterbury scenario, but that wasn't in existence then. And so that, we describe it, I think singular feeder teams have won like 84% of the titles in Super Rugby. It's that much easier. It's like,
that's an insane stat.
It's like in the world of rugby, a country with 3 or 4 professional teams has won most of the World Cups, right? 3 or 4 or 5, of course. Sorry, I apologize. Whereas it's just harder for England, right? For England to win a World Cup, they have to be together for like 8 years. Whereas, and I remember, because I looked at the numbers for 2003, and like, we hadn't been together that long as a national team, but because of our domestic system, the numbers for the game against England, that we were almost identical, but we were doing it with half the experience. And it reminds me, because like the Panthers 3 years ago won the NRL with the second least experienced team in the comp. Right. So those who say experience is everything, it's not necessarily, I believe, to be the case. Sometimes it's how things are structured. So we've deviated right off the path. I apologize.
I love it, mate. I love it. And this is why I love numbers and analytics. It's because you can apply it across so many examples, and you've got all this in your head, and then obviously with Gainline, but then also just being able to apply that for all those listeners and watchers that be able to think about their own experiences and their own mind maps. It's awesome to hear, and I'm sure they're going to be able to take something really, really important away from it. We've been dancing around the question that I think a lot of people will want to know, and that is, what is the actual strength of this British and Irish Lions side that's coming down to Australia in just a month's time?
I mean, you're going to have to point to Leinster. as their strength. The hard part is, in a way, is because you've got an Irish coach, he doesn't want to appear to be biased, right? Gatland never had a problem with that. He never had a problem being biased towards Wales, and I think that's what won them the series last time.
Yeah.
And you look at that, if you look at the numbers and you look at how many Welsh they had in that last test, they literally said, we think O'Driscoll's the better player, but it's not the better combination. Right. Now, one thing we know is
that was a big drama at the time. That was massive.
Yeah. And actually, I remember Justin Harrison saying in the warm up, the preview to the game, is he said, "I'm not scared of the individuals, but I'm scared of the collective because of what they picked." And that was absolutely the case. Things went a little bit pear-shaped for a whole range of reasons and injuries and things like that in the game, but that was definitely their strongest side that they put together. If you look at the Lions generally, they historically in the professional era have actually won game one more. So one of the things we look at is recency, and I'll jump here to, we found in the NRL that if a team had a lot of Australian players in it, then their start of the year would be quite hard the next year because they would be coming back late because they have to get time off.
Yep.
I distinctly remember joining the Brumbies late after we would do a November tour.
Yep.
And so we would get guys back. We'd coming back like mid-January because we had time off. And so what you would actually find would be, the Crusaders would generally start pretty slow most of the time. Their worst game was the worst game. I remember the Rebels beating them a couple of years ago in round one. And so I remember we had in 01 was we had the New Zealand Maori game, and then it was straight into the Lions, whereas they were 5 or 6 games in. Now they don't have anywhere near the cohesion we probably had collectively, but there's an absolute recency factor to it.
Yep.
That creates its own problem. So I think they're like 60, 70% of the time they'll win game one, and then game two will drop back to 40, 50%. I'll have to go back and look at the numbers, but it definitely...
Is that game one of the series or test one? Sorry, just to clarify.
Oh, sorry. The test. So there's 5 or 6 games in, but it's the first test.
Yep.
So they'll get 5 or 6 games, then play the first test. We would play one game, then we would play the first test.
Yeah.
Right?
So we've got Fiji this year. That's our one game, and then we head.
Yeah, that's our one game, exactly.
Yeah.
And so it's a real rush for the home test nation into that game. I think that would be less of the case in the 21 series because of COVID and just the way that was built. But the Springboks hadn't been playing it all during 20. And then it kind of sorts itself out as you go along, and then the home nation then gets that time together. And it's similar. For example, I remember the All Blacks talking about how they were happy to catch Ireland at the start of November because the All Blacks have basically been playing since June, whereas Ireland had only played a couple of tests basically since the Six Nations, which is in February. So there's these kind of, you don't get this in the NRL or Super Rugby as much because you're basically all playing the same amount of games. Whereas these are teams hitting each other at different points along, and there's different components of recency, and then there's long-term time together, and then different influences. We had an interesting comment once, and I think it particularly relates to to what's been happening with Ireland, is that somebody at Leinster said one of the problems we have with Leinster is getting the Ireland out of them when they come back. Right? Because they'll go away, play for Ireland, Six Nations, come back to us, and all of a sudden they're doing everything different. Yeah. And I actually experienced this myself when I was with the Wallabies, and I went back to play a game for the Brumbies against Tonga. And I could not remember any of the line-out defensive patterns because all the Wallaby systems were in my head. Yeah. And Justin Harrison was screaming at me and saying, "Oh, what are you doing?" I'm like, "I don't know where to go." And I just couldn't, and it got more and more stressful, and I couldn't figure it out. And it was like they were colliding in my head. And that's one of the things that I think, at least having played, I'm trying to find a number to represent that experience. Yeah. And a lot of this research came off the back of a conversation with Al Baxter once, which is like, he said to me, "I can't scrummage with JP." And I said, "I can't scrummage with Cano." and he said, I said, "Why?" And he said, like, "It just feels completely wrong." And I said, "I feel the exact opposite. It only feels good with JP. Cano, I can't get used to." Now, I love them both as men, so nothing to do with that. Yeah. It it was just not comfortable because of just how we both set up, right? So when I was on the field with JP, fantastic, get great outcomes. With Cano, I was always getting it wrong, or Foles, same thing. And with Al, it was the opposite.
Yeah.
And it just made me start thinking about this sort of stuff.
That's crazy. But I think you gave a similar analogy when we won't go into that one, but John Eales and who he had along his ride in Wallabies and Queensland colours, about who he played with when he went into a new environment, into Wallabies and leading Wallabies, and there was such a big factor about who he had next to him right there in the scrum in the second row.
Yeah, if I can, I'm happy to talk about it, but I think it's more of a reflection of the structure we had at the time. So he and McCall played together at Brothers.
Yep.
And then when they played Tests, they played together. And then when they played State, they played together for Queensland. And then when they go into Tests, and I think, I believe this is right. I think it was John's 38th Test was the first time he played with a non-Queenslander in the locking partner, which I think was John Wellborn from memory, because he had McCall, he had Garrick Morgan, all those guys. And so when you compare that to the systems we have now, that just doesn't happen accidentally as much as it used to.
Never. Yeah. When you told me that, I racked my brain about the 23 Wallabies that were most picked last year, and I was thinking about who would have actually had 38 games with the person next to them in any position, and the number was zero. Pretty much. Like if unless you look at someone like the front row with the Brumby, front row with the Pollard and James Slipper and Alatoa, those guys have played a lot of games together, but not tests. So I guess then again, you get a new stress on that relationship.
If you go back and you look at the 99 Wallaby final, and then you go back to that, do you remember the game, the push-up test where we played England in 98?
I was 1 year old at the time.
Yeah, okay. So England weren't allowed their main players at all. And so they sent out a bunch of kids, but included Vickery and Wilkinson and those guys. But because of the way England are, they struggled. Their first test, 78-7, something like that, to the Wallabies.
Easy.
And they had these guys at the end of the field do push-ups. And when Australia got to 21 points, they had to do 21 push-ups. By the time Australia got to 50, they went to sit-ups. It was just getting too difficult for them, right? So it was at Lane Park. So particularly late, Australia has accelerated their lead, right? Now, that team, the only two differences to that side from the one that started the 99 final was Kearns, who was injured, and Tom Bowman, who's replaced by David Giffen. Every other player was the same. That was like 20 tests later. You just would never see anything like that now. And so Rod kept that group, even though you had a stack of Queenslanders anyway, which they gave them cohesion in its other forms, but the stability of that team leading into that group. And that's why, if we say cohesion equals defense, when that starting team was on, they didn't let on a try through the whole tournament, except when our A team was on. And I think Grobbelaar scored a try from USA. So the USA is the only team that scored a try against us in that tournament, right? And that's nothing to do with the quality of the guys in the A team. It was just more of a mixed-up team. Right?
Yeah. It's actually insanity how you start painting a picture and then it becomes more and more clear, but you start thinking, why is it clearer now? Because you're pulling from things that are kind of, you think are in obscurity, but then when the picture comes together, they start fitting together quite nicely. And then I think that's led us exactly to, now that we're on the history of the Australian side, how are you seeing the cohesion and the strength of this Wallaby side heading into this series? Because we've touched on the fact that they're coming in cold compared to the Lions players, but nonetheless they had a year now under Joe Schmidt. How are they looking in your metrics, in your eyes?
The easiest way to put it would be improved, but I think it's important to note just how bad things were in 23. Right. And this is not for me to say different people make different decisions, but you can sort of see in the process of 23 that Eddie's probably looked at that group and go, well, I can't get it done with this group, so I'm going to think about 27. So anyone who's not going to be in 27 is going to go. I'm going to go with kids. And the problem is the way in which our system is now constructed is when you go with kids, the numbers are going to be diabolically bad.
Yep.
And the other problem is that it's not like, so if you look at the first World Cup in '87, there was only one cohesive team, which was New Zealand, who won it because there was 11 or 12 Aucklanders in the side. It was ridiculous. If you think of every World Cup since then, basically one more team has joined them in terms of being a cohesive team. And it comes off a lot of the World Rugby policies around building domestic systems around the world. So in South America, particularly, and in Europe, Portugal, in South America, Chile, Uruguay, they're getting club teams. They're building systems that are more effective. Ireland is a very different structure to what it used to be. Wales, a different structure. Scotland's a different structure. And so there's been this kind of evening out where you've now got 10 teams around the world who are quite well built, and then another 5 or 6 who are pretty well built, right? Like the Drua has had a pretty profound impact on the Fijians. Okay.
Yep.
In the late 80s, early 90s, that just wasn't the case. There was 1 or 2 well-built teams, and it was, of course, they were in the Southern Hemisphere. So now you're not guaranteed of getting out of your pool like you probably used to be if you were reasonably well built. And so we're fighting a losing battle on that front, not losing battle, but a difficult battle on that front. And so what Joe's done is he's sort of stabilized the team. We haven't really made any changes structurally in terms of how we are built in Australian rugby, but in terms of the things you can do inside of that system to basically build yourself a better team, we're probably doing at the moment. But of course, I'm probably someone that's probably advocating more for a rethink on the entire construct of how we put it together that gives us a chance to be more sustainably successful. So when you do what the Panthers have done, for example, you give yourself a chance at being sustainably successful. When you don't have a well-built system, which we don't currently, then you can be successful if you really work hard at it for a period of time, and then you'll revert. So you'll go in waves. I hope that makes sense.
Yep. And so with the consolidation of the Super Rugby sides into 4 sides from 5, are you seeing that as that being able to be a strength that can feed into a Wallabies environment for this season, or is it too soon to bear any fruit from that sort of consolidation? Because there's players like Darcy Swain and Jeremy Williams. Now, no one's been picked. The squad hasn't been picked, but they're a very solid locking duo that have put out quite good numbers. And then you've also got a lot of the Brumbies boys who have obviously been together for a lot of the time. They haven't necessarily consolidated, as we mentioned earlier. But then you've got the Waratahs, which is a schmozzle, and they haven't done particularly well, but as expected per your data input. They've
actually done great by our data. They've had a cracking year by our data.
Cracking year by our data.
Describe it. Yeah. They've probably overperformed. Probably got 1 or 2 more wins, more than they thought we thought they would. So Dan's done a great job on that front.
Perhaps not what the public wanted, but definitely an improvement on last year. But so do you see this consolidation from 5 to 4 teams being able to bear any fruit at the national level?
It absolutely can. It's just not a leapfrog into what could fundamentally be a much stronger system.
Yep.
And I think how we construct how we run our tier 3, how we run the clubs at that Super Rugby level, the decisions that they're making. Now, all of this requires vast sums of money. If I could give Rugby Australia $1 billion and say, how about it? I'm sure they could do all of these. They've got to choose which ones they need to use and how they're going to go about doing that. Yeah. I think one of the biggest questions is what can we do sustainably with the amount of money we have, and what can that impact can that have? Because one thing you don't want to be doing is making more changes.
Yep.
Because we've done nothing but change. In the past 25 years, we've gone more clubs, we've gone an ARC out of an ARC, having an NRC, losing an NRC, and I think we've gone 3, 4, 5, 4, 5, 4. And then having an Australia A program, not really having an Australia A program. Whereas, with New Zealand, even though they've got 5, their tier 3 has been relatively settled, and they've been running New Zealand Maori, New Zealand A pretty consistently. They have their own issues there. I think one of the biggest things is that we've both been coming down together in our cohesion over the last 25 years, but we've never really noticed it because New Zealand was coming off such a high base and they were smacking us so often. But I think you could start to notice that, for example, in how the All Blacks have started doing against Ireland in the last 10 years, or, the Northern Hemisphere teams who are really getting themselves organised.
Mm. And so I guess from that, you're saying that there could be fruit born from the consolidation, not structurally, as you mentioned as well, but then that does feed into how do you see their relative strength matching up? Because it's all that anyone in Australia can think about, and especially up in the UK and Ireland. Where do you see this kind of game? Where do you see this Test match series going?
So I think the easiest way to describe this next part of the discussion is small change is big change,
Hmm.
right? If you make 3 changes to a test team, it fundamentally is a different test team altogether.
Okay.
So I don't know who both teams are going to pick.
Hmm.
The Lions have a team available to them they could pick tomorrow that would be better built than what we currently have,
Yep.
than what we have plausibly, by my best guess, because I don't have all 1.5 billion, machinations
Yeah.
that you could come out with. Whether they do that and then how they build through it is the important part. How they build through the first 6 games, how they use these first 6 games, 7 games into the first test,
Hmm.
and then what Australia choose, and then things like injuries and cards. Like, I could make every prediction under the sun, and you get 2 red cards, it doesn't matter what I've said.
Yeah.
Right? It's over. So, and it just becomes about the gap. I think one of the things that's really interesting with the Lions is how they use their bench.
Hmm.
And generally, Lions series will have more kicking at goal, more penalty goals than normal series will. So accuracy of kicking, as you mentioned, KB's slip.
Yeah.
Why wasn't he wearing a prop studs, 12? Who knows? But
should have lent him your screws.
yeah. But one stat I came out with the other day, I don't know if you saw this, and I'm probably going to read it out wrong now, but in the Lions series in 1997, there was 8 tries and like 20 something penalty goals before there was a successful conversion.
Jesus.
Yeah, it wasn't until the second test, till the 8th try was scored, that somebody kicked the conversion, which tells you all the tries were being scored out wide, and
Yeah.
the Lions weren't scoring a lot of penalty goals.
Weren't kicking
Can I,
well
can,
as well,
can I,
clearly.
can I check that for a second? Is that
Yeah,
okay?
yeah, go for it. Check
Yeah.
for it. I think what's extremely interesting about that is that, and we'll get into some Super Rugby chat in a sec, but
Sure.
because you start looking at who the tens are and who the kickers are for the Wallabies, and you've got the incumbent Wallaby, number 10, Noah Lolesio, not kicking particularly well this year. And you've got someone like Tom Liner, who's definitely in the Wallaby conversation, kicking the best out of him, Donaldson, and Lolesio, who are the 3.58s last year, along with along with Edmed, who's not quite in the picture currently. But, despite all the machinations and whatnot, so a kicking stat that you've brought up now, extremely interesting, because as we saw, it could very much come down to the boot of a kicker. So that's terrifying. But what did you find? Are you
Yeah,
on the money?
yeah, no, I got it slightly wrong. So in the 1997 Lions test matches, there were 14 penalty goals, 1 drop goal, and 8 tries scored before a single conversion was kicked. So they were hitting all the penalty goals, but no one was hitting conversions, which probably speaks more to the width that everyone was playing with.
Yeah.
But there just does seem to be, kicking is sort of extremely important within the sort of context of the series. And I think too, there's a lot of, people tend to kick more, obviously, in the Northern Hemisphere. I remember Gareth Dell, when he was at the Rebels, talking because he was captain of the Rebels, he was like, kick for goal, kick for goal. And we were like, Gareth, we want to entertain the crowd or whatever.
Yeah.
And he's like, you don't understand how much pressure, scoreboard pressure, it continuously puts on teams, because they'll start to back off at the breakdown if we keep hitting them a penalty every time, right? So it was like that, it will affect how teams defend, which I hadn't really thought of, to be honest with you, up until that point. But I think people are nervous. When people are nervous about losing games, people go for the sticks, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that there will be, so accuracy of kicking might be a really important part of the series, and this is an area I simply do not know anything about. Like I know that part.
The front rowers kicking squad. There's been some amazing moments over the last 2 years with the hooker from Portugal absolutely launching a beautiful 50-22, or I think it was in the World Cup. And so I'm sure that if you got your boots on, we could people would love to be able to see a kick be
No,
launched.
it's not happening. It's not happening. But you know, like the Lions in and of themselves, you know, because of that cohesion factor, are not necessarily built to defend, right? So you do get tries scored by the home nation, generally quite a bit more than the Lions, and the Lions stay in it through kicking penalty goals, and they've had obviously some crackers over the time. If you look at that, you know, that Lions series in '97, the second test, they didn't score a try. Right? I think it was 5 penalty goals and a drop goal, you know, won in that game. So they of course are going to play to their strengths. Now, in terms of the lead-in, if I could just mention that for a second, to the lead-in of all the games. So I've been thinking about it quite a bit, and if you look at the choices that the Lions have, so in the lead into the first test, you have Argentina in Dublin. And then 7 days later, you have the Western Force in Perth. And then you start the midweek games, which I think is the second, which is the Reds. And the Waratahs is on the weekend. The Brumbies is the midweek. And then you have the Adelaide Oval game. And that's then 7 days out from the first test in Brisbane. Okay. So you would generally think, okay, the midweek team will be the B team and the weekend game will be the A team. But if you come at it from a different perspective and think, okay, well, a 10 days lead in is not a bad idea into a test match, because they're going to get pretty intense after that. So, and then if you think about, they want probably the strongest opposition they can get. So if they say, okay, we play the first game against Argentina, that'll be on the 21st. That's on the weekend game. And then that, so let's say we put the A team against Argentina. Now, the two strongest teams by cohesion in Super Rugby, and of course, we're not taking the test players out of these teams, but which they will have to deal with. But if you just look at the two strongest teams have been the Reds and the Brumbies. And then the two weakest from a cohesion perspective being the Force Tars, and they're almost identical, and that played out quite nicely on the weekend. Probably 10 minutes of the worst rugby I've ever seen in my life.
It was maybe 80 minutes of difficult watching, but yes, 10 minutes it was difficult.
I think I turned back to Paw Patrol at the end. That's how bad things were. So, if you say, okay, let's put the A team against Argentina, let's put the B team, and forgive me anyone for saying B team, but that's the only way we can talk about it right now. Is they want to be playing their top team generally at some point together. They have to build cohesion, right? So if, let's say he's decided 12 of the 15, he kind of knows who there's going to be there. And as someone mentioned to me the other day, like wherever Itoji plays, being captain is going to be the starting team. I reckon they might not do that, given how much rugby has been playing late. So let's say Argentina is the first game. That's on a Saturday. Then you put your B team against the Force. Then you go midweek Reds, that being the second strongest team in Australia. On the weekend, you put your B team against the Tars. Then you go midweek Brumbies. Then the other teams that are going to be weak in this series are going to be, because of cohesion, I imagine, is going to be the invitational team. Which guys coming back from Japan, however I don't know how they're going to pick this team, but there isn't really one you can pick that's well built. And then obviously the First Nations Pacifica is going to have its own challenges on that front from a cohesion perspective. So what it means then is you basically put your A team against the Brumbies, then you get a 10-day lead in to the first test to fix whatever problems you need to fix, which will be many given the amount of time they've had together. You can put your B team against that AU. That then won't be a 100-point, you know, which you don't want is what Rugby Australia doesn't want is these games to be a debacle, as in big, because then the Lions will say, if you're not going to put good teams against us, we're not going to play 10 games. We're going to go to Argentina next time and play 3 tests, then come over here and only play 5 games against you, right? So that's in a challenge, and all the pressure that's coming onto the Lions in terms of limiting the tour anyway. And so that then gives them an easier then lead into the Pacifica game where they can put their B team against them after they played the second test. So that then becomes the 19th and then the 26th, because you're playing 3 tests in 3 weeks anyway. Why not have a 10-day lead into that? Otherwise, you're just going week, 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 week. So
Yep.
I reckon that's. I don't know anything. I don't know have any inside information, but I think if you take it from that perspective, who they pick, we'll know when they play Argentina, right?
Yeah.
Because they won't want to make too many changes to whatever they think their A team is. And generally, the tours they've had where they've had the most success, you can tell a long way out who they're going to have. When it's been a disaster, which was 21 because of COVID and 05 because of Clive taking half the population of the United Kingdom on the tour with him, and then not wanting to be biased towards the English, or just every debacle that tour could have been, it was. And then it's hard because they also were playing some fantastic opposition, and when you lose, you make changes, right? That's an action bias. So I think this could be the way they go about doing it. I'm just really interested to see who they pick and where they pick them, and if they pick them in groups and how it takes place. But whenever, we saw this in the Rugby League World Cup a couple of years ago, is they had a whole stack of guys from the Panthers in that team, and you're like, oh wow, they're going to be really well built. The problem wasn't between the Panthers guys; it was the Panthers guys and the new guys, or the new guys for the Panthers guys. It was like putting the two together. And all they needed was 4 or 5 games, and they ended up making the final. They got belted by England in the first game. So it's the merging of Leinster and everyone else that's going to be the problem on this trip, right? Ireland, not Leinster, Ireland.
Yeah, no. But I mean, people would say, can you spot the difference if I showed you a picture of Ireland and Leinster? So I don't think, maybe a Freudian slip. I'm not sure.
No, it wasn't.
Yeah. But I think that is really interesting, because that takes us then again to like that cohesion factor, as we spoke about earlier, and then how you're going to play. So number one, everyone keep your eyes on that Argentina game, because we might actually get a little bit of intel on how the tour is going to look after that. But then also, I think that, if you're Joe Schmidt and you're heading into this Fiji test, obviously it's far enough out that a 12-day mandatory stand down would not affect a person who would receive a concussion in that game if they're playing in that Fiji test. So that's very well strategically placed. I'm sure that's all on purpose. But so how does Joe Schmidt approach that Fiji game? You might have someone like Joseph-Aukuso Suaalii just coming back from a jaw fracture. You might have Max Jorgensen coming back from a syndesmosis. Does he just have to go and play his strongest team? Is that what he has to do? Because he has got one shot at cohesion, as you and I have. Or is that too much of a simplistic look at how this may work together?
It worries me, because I don't know if you remember the lead into the 2011 World Cup. We played Samoa and lost in Sydney.
I do remember that. Alasana Tuolangi was absolutely terrorizing Rod Davies. That winger was having a bad day at the office.
Yeah. So if Fiji's a great team to play against, but the hard part about this is going to be if it goes wrong.
Yep.
So if he picks a team and it plays well, he'll stick with that team. If he picks a team and it goes wrong, which it should do because of being that first game, we should be bad, right? What do you do then? And if they do make changes, it's too late.
Yep.
Right. Depending on what type of changes they are, of course. Okay. So and I'll use rugby league as an example, that period of time when Queensland won 11 straight state of origins was really built off of Storm, Spine, Broncos and Cowboys, rest of the team. If during that time you went away from the Storm Spine, you could always bring it back.
Yep.
Right. And it would function like that. No problems. Yep. If he has a team in mind that can function already very well, or we have a team like we did in, say, 99, that you could okay, well, let's try someone else in the centres other than Herbert, Horan and Little. That may or may not work. We could always come back to it. Yep. We don't really have that much to come back to. Yeah. We don't have a default team right now. Yep. Therein lies the problem, because the Springboks know their default team, right? Because he's been basically he's had that group really consistently for a long period of time, and he can always return to it. And so that's having that luxury of that long-term component, and all of the changes that we've made and all the way in which the team has been built and how Joe did last year is it was really time to figure out who his default team was.
Yep.
And I don't think he's quite there yet.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just the nature of it. It's just
Yep.
that last year was not enough time to do it. And then we've got other issues with, with concussion and other issues with injuries.
Mm.
We talk a lot about, one of the clubs we work with in the UK is saying, okay, we know your team is the best team in the comp when it's on the field. How many injuries can you deal with and still be the best team in the world?
Yep.
And I don't know if you remember in 05-06, the All Blacks made 14 changes and still put 40 on Ireland because they picked 14 Crusaders in their team.
I do not remember that, but yeah, that sounds about right.
They can't do that now, but they could do that.
Yeah.
We don't have, and when we have the scenario we don't have any ability to absorb any injuries, which is what Eddie had last year, right? So you have 1 or 2 injuries, you're done.
Yep.
We're not quite at the point where we can absorb injuries, or we really don't have a default team to sort of move to in terms of how it's built. And the easiest thing I have to say is you don't find combinations, you build combinations. There isn't one. You can't go, oh, I think this might work. The only time sort of like new combinations work is when you get to play games against like that England team in '98, which had which was so entirely new. Whatever you put against it was going to slaughter it.
Yeah.
Right. That's when new combinations work. And if you have a game like that where you win by a ton, you're thinking, oh, this is fantastic. And then you play the All Blacks the next week and go, oh, maybe that combination isn't quite ready yet. It's not quite constructed to be successful.
And I think that therein lies a new word that I think we can carry forward into this series, your default team. So I think that's a really good concept because a lot of people often pundits from all kinds of channels speaks about combinations, but they also don't, that also doesn't touch on the context of where those combinations sit in the wider ecosystem of the team. So that's great, and thank you so much for sharing that phrase, because it's going to be important when we start looking at the actual test games and the Super Rugby games, which is going to it's a month away. It is we're recording on the 28th. It is insanity that it's so close. I can't wait. Then I just wanted to say also, so where are combinations most, is there a place on the field where combinations are the most important? Is it between 9 and 10? Doesn't matter. Is it the props, or is it completely irrelevant where you have the cohesion? Because you're speaking about partnerships, and I'm sure that if you put Nonu and Conrad Smith in a side somewhere together, they'd be able to make certain things work. But does it matter where these combinations are coming from, or is it just you need a majority of the cohesion to work together and then to be able to transition seamlessly with, as you used the Penrith Panther example earlier, do you just need those two different bodies speaking with each other effectively?
Well, I think that's interesting about the Conrad Smith and Nonu example, because, when Nonu moved to the Highlanders or was at Auckland, people accused him of not caring about Super Rugby and only caring about Test Rugby because he was playing well in tests. But guess what? He was playing with his old mate Conrad from the Hurricanes, right? So, one of the things that's really interesting, and I was talking to somebody about this week, is what happens to you when you don't know what to do. And you basically, your thought processes leave the now and they go into the future, or they go into the past. And so this is how it's described to me by psychologists. I'm not making it up, but you sort of leave the context in which you're in, and all of your mental thinking goes into, God, this is going to be a disaster. I know what it's like to be in this situation when things go awry and you're not sure, because when you are not sure what to do, you can really panic. Right. And so no matter how experienced you are, and I remember talking to James Holbeck, and he was saying, he was talking about a test in which he and I think Horan or Little were playing together for the first time, and the All Blacks were just slicing them apart. And he said, we looked at each other and we both knew there was nothing we could draw on that would help us. Because we didn't have
That's
that.
That's a dark place to be in.
Yeah, I know. It was like 10 minutes in. And it's like, we don't know if he's going to hold or he's going to shoot and what it's going to look like. And so, now that being said, the 10, 12, 13 is absolutely crucial. If you think about that Wales test, is that we had a 10, 12, 13 combination and not played together. I think 10, 12 had never played together in that test.
Yeah. Is this the World Cup, is it?
Yeah. So the game against Wales, and that's exactly where they went through, right? If you look at the game where we ended up with a 12-13 combination that was completely new in the 19 World Cup in Japan, because is it not Hunter Paisami, who was the guy who came in as the centre pairing in that quarterfinal?
Was it Matt Tamua?
No. It was
Kurandrani, Pataya.
Yeah, Jordan Pataya. Hang on, let me just. I have a list of every Wallaby team since 1899. So I'm gonna. Some poor bloke helped me put this together. Okay, so if you look at the '99 World Cup final was Hoare and Herbert, which is obviously Queensland.
Yep.
03 was Flatley and Mortlock, and we'd been moving around, with Rogers and those guys into that back line, but we sort of went back for something we had. That's a great example of a default you could return to, right? If you look at 07, sorry, we've already done that, haven't we? 07, we had Gitto Mortlock.
Yep.
Then we're reverting again. In 2011, you had McCabe and Anthony Fainga. That's the game we lost against the All Blacks. That's probably a new combination. 2015, we had Gitto and Kurandrani. So there's a bit of old Brumbies in that. So that was pretty well set up. And of course, 15, we went heavy on the Tars generally. 19 was Karevi and Patea, who were Queensland teammates, but hadn't really played together in the centres. Right. And, if you look at the centre pairings we had through the end of 18 into 19, we went, Beale, Karevi, Beale, Hodge, Tamua, Hodge, Beale, Hodge again, Beale, Falau, Beale, Karevi, Foley, Karevi, Karevi, Kurandrani, Karevi, O'Connor, Tamua, Adam Ashley Cooper, Tamua, Kurandrani, Karevi, James O'Connor, and then literally, so all of those combinations had played together, and then the one that played against England had never played together, which was Karevi, Jordan Patea. And then that was what it was. So you want to be doing that stuff a year and a half out, not in the game, right? And then if we now go to 23, it was not 12-13, but 10-12, which was Donaldson, Karevi, and Patea. And then through Wet Wales, but that wasn't a knockout game. That was still a group game, but it was a knockout game. Right?
Exactly.
So what the Springboks had in the last two World Cups, they had 2 or 3 different established combinations in the centres, which is exactly where you want to be.
So, Ben, now that you've gone through the machinations of what a centre pairing can and cannot do off the back of Nonu and Conrad Smith chat, people will want to know, is Joseph-Aukuso, Suaalii and Ikitau a good idea for Test 1 for the Wallabies in Fiji, and then carrying in to the first Game 1 against British and Irish Lions in July 19th?
So, first things first, I don't know anything about centres at all, right? I only know a little bit about scrummaging at tight head prop between the year 1998 and 2005. Other than that,
didn't hit any gaps.
Knowledge less, right? Now, but I'll give you this analogy. Okay, so let's pretend, for example, that we need to play a game of tennis for your life, right? And you have to pick a pair of people to play that game. Okay, so if you had a week, right, until that game was played to get this pair ready, right, you would pick the Bryan brothers. Okay, Bryan brothers, pair of identical twins. They won 119 tournaments together. The greatest doubles pairing of all time. Okay, but they're not the most skillful tennis players, I would imagine.
People would go to Djokovic, Nadal, Serena Williams.
So let's say we had 2 years to do it. Right. Okay, well then we would give Federer and Nadal 2 years of playing doubles together, and they would probably beat the Bryan brothers. They would be a better pairing if you had enough time. Right. So it's not saying who do you pick. It's about how long do you have to establish what you want. Because people say to me, well, I can't just pick the same guys who played at school together. That's not going to work. And it's like, no, it's about the context over talent versus cohesion, right?
Yeah.
How long would it take for those two guys to figure out how to play together in that scenario? And the challenge with centers is it takes quite a while to figure out how to play together in that scenario with the level of complexity in the game. And changing to the centers is really, really hard. You look at the league guys who tried to do it, it's been difficult for them. And so I think that sort of tends to answer the questions. If we don't have time, let's go with something established. But here's the thing is, it's not just, people say, well, we want to pick centers together, but it's not always centers who stand together. Sometimes centers have to stand next to props. Right?
Yeah.
So it's not just the combinations in those specific areas. You need combinations across the field and processes across the field and understanding of role. I don't know if you remember when Bergamasco played at 9, he was the flanker. Just throwing balls, 50, that's one of the great examples of guys, or Kano playing for the All Blacks at 5 when they lost to Ireland by 30, 40 points. Because Tuipulotu was having a baby or something. So it's like, someone great in one position doesn't mean they'll be great in another position. It's the variation of that component. So just because we get it right in that combination, we have to get it right in as many combinations as we can across the field and be able to deal with whatever comes at us. And so for both teams, I mean, I think for the setup that the Lions have and the teams you have, it can be decided by something so simple, such as kicking or such as injury or such as cards. So whoever doesn't win this series, let's not be too hard on them because most of the things that are going to take place in this series are probably outside of their control.
Yeah. I think that there's so much that's been said in this chat that I'm sure that it's not only my head that's spinning, but also extremely full of new ways to think about certain things, new things to consider, and also hopefully a little bit more rugby knowledge that I'll be able to apply down the line. But Ben, I just want to say thank you so much. You've been so tremendously generous with your time, and the tangents and the rabbit holes that we went down tonight are just amazing. And I'm glad that we ended up discussing some backwater rugby moments in a faraway land that got us eventually talking about how certain professional sides end up playing well together or playing poorly together for that matter, which may actually very well be. As I think a lot of things that I went into tonight was about talking about, I'm going to say positive or affirmative actions, and then a lot what you've thrown back at me is the things that don't happen, or the negative, if I may say that, not negative as in a bad thing, but negative as in the things that are not happening or the things that you're not looking at or not going through. So that is incredible, and I'm so stoked to be able to have all that now that I have to make sense of in my head. But is there anything finally that you would say about the series that you wanted to touch on that's gonna be important for people looking ahead?
I think that just generally, one of the things that drives me the most insane is when people say the team that's going to win is the team that wants it most. Is that when teams are not performing well, everyone's doing the best they can. And I get frustrated, I suppose, when people are canning players, he's useless, is to always think about the context of that performance. And, like any player that's had to come from the Rebels to the Tars this year, it's been really hard on them, right? You see what challenge the Tupou's going through, and it affects different people in different ways. And some of that can be, for example, for the wingers, it's much easier than for the centers or for the locks, right? Because there's more for them to be able to deal with. So I think that this term attribution bias, which I really like, which is we tend to think about the performance of the individual being a reflection on them, not the situation that person is in. And I've heard guys talk about, there's a particular player who played a test for the Northern Hemisphere team and came in from outside the country to play it, played 2 or 3 games and played poorly, and basically saying it's the greatest regret of my life, and almost being suicidal over it. Right? So I'm not going to mention this person's name, but now that we sort of understand the context of this, it's like it's entirely predictable that should be the case. To be hard for that person to come in, and that performing poorly given that scenario is what should happen, right? what should have then happened then is they go, right, I'll give you another 10 tests to figure this out, but that's not test rugby. Like, they don't have that. So I think it's really important that people have context for anyone's performance when looking at it, and being a little bit kinder in how they reflect on it.
Well, I think that in a world where the pressure is perhaps higher than it's ever been, and the stakes, especially for Australian rugby, are probably quite high, considering the amount of charge that sits around this Lions series. I think that's very wise words, and I think that there's a lot of people out there in the comments on different platforms and different social medias that may need to keep this in mind, especially heading into this series, whether it's the Super Rugby First Nations, Pacifica, or Oz and Zach unofficial side heading into as well as the test team. So Ben, I just again want to thank you so much for your time. You've been extremely generous, and I've learned a lot, and I hope everyone on Off the Ruck who's watching and listening on your various platforms has done so as well. Thank you so much, Ben.
Pleasure.